Ladies and gentlemen, we now discover the untold stories of India's aviation pioneers through an engaging conversation, wherein Stephen Barker, the author of Lion of the Skies, Hardit Singh Malik, the Royal Air Force, and the First World War, will take you on a riveting journey through the life of Hardit Singh Malik, shedding light on his groundbreaking contributions to aviation. Serving as our esteemed moderator is K.S. Nair, who authored The Forgotten Few, the Indian Air Force in World War II, sharing the heroic tales of the often overlooked Indian Air Force veterans. This discussion promises to be an enlightening exploration of India's aviation history, celebrating the trailblazers who soared to new heights. Let's please welcome them on the stage with a huge round of applause, Stephen Barker and K.S. Nair.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to this, I was going to say graveyard shift, but perhaps not. So, we have been told that there are elaborate setups required for the valedictory function of the 2 days that we've had. So I will make this as quick as possible. And just say that I'm K.S. Nair, as I was introduced. Stephen Barker is a heritage professional and consultant, and he's written a number of books. But the one we're looking at right now is, in India, is published as Lion of the Skies, the story of Hardit Singh Malik, who was the very first Indian to formally get a pilot's license and flew for the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Air Force during the First World War. Now, that was a very different time from the Second World War, and among other things, the strain, the differences between Indian political leadership and the British establishment were, I think, less than they were by the start of the Second World War, but the opportunities available to Indians were formally much less. And the story of how Hardit Singh Malik made it to commissioned status and to becoming the first Indian to qualify formally as a pilot is interwoven in Stephen's book with investigations into how the British developed the decision to allow commissions in the armed forces to Indians. And this, I think, was a very significant move. So that's all I'm going to say for now. I will hand over to Stephen. Over to you. So.
Thank you, Shri. And thanks to USI, United Services Institute of India, for inviting me to this wonderful conference, very well organized by Squadron Leader Chinna. Excellent event. I hope it's the first of many. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for listening. I'll explain where we're going to go in the next half an hour, but I'm going to make a start with about 20 slides. In April of 1917, a young, recently recruited, beturbaned, Sikh Royal Flying Corps cadet was spotted by the Sergeant Major on the parade ground at Aldershot, it's a main training base in England. He was the archetypal non-commissioned officer, red face, bull neck, big moustache, commanding voice. "Why aren't you in uniform?" he said to the Sikh. "I am. What do you mean?" "Where is your at?" "As a devout Sikh, I must wear a turban." The Sergeant Major was having none of it. The young man's name was Hardit Singh Malik, a British subject from Rawalpindi, in what of course was United India at that time. He's 23 years old. Next slide, please. Fortunately, an adjutant, another officer, on the edge of the parade ground noticed Hardit Singh Malik's predicament. The matter was referred to the CO, and eventually special dispensation was granted for the turban to be worn by the War Office. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes. I've omitted from my usual talk the biographical details, but if you want to catch up with the biographical details, I can recommend nothing more than my book, which is full of lovely biographical details. I'm going to let people talk for themselves as much as possible, particularly Hardit Singh, and the talk is arranged chronologically. It's mainly about his participation in the First World War, although he had an outstanding career after the First World War. And I've decided to share with you one thing that I think you might just find of interest, and that's one political theme which involved a debate taking place in the corridors of power in London and in Delhi, which, although he never knew it ever in his lifetime, Hardit Singh Malik was a part. And as Sri said, that debate was about Indian nationals living in Britain taking officer commissions in Britain's armed forces during the First World War with the same status as British officers. And that debate is between four organisations: the India Office, the War Office, the Air Ministry in London, in Whitehall, and the Government of India in Delhi. Who are these two chaps behind me? On the left is Edwin Montagu, Secretary of State for India for the second half of the First World War. And on the right, the Viceroy of India. What you might be interested to know is that the two of them, at the end of the First World War, they exchanged telegrams between London and Delhi, which name-check Hardit Singh Malik personally. How is it that a young Sikh flyer living in London, who's flying with the Royal Flying Corps, has come to the attention of the Viceroy and the Secretary of State for India? More about that soon. Next slide, please. Just some basic biographical details for you. In 1908, Hardit Singh travelled alone to Britain, alone, as a 14-year-old. He was educated at a prep school in London and then at Eastbourne College on the south coast of England. And then he attends Balliol College at Oxford. He's a bright guy. And this is where I discovered him about 10 years ago. He became very talented at golf. In fact, he was India's best golfer between the wars. And also cricket. He played first-class cricket in England in 1914 and 1921 for Sussex County Cricket Club. But what I'd like you to know is that when the war broke out, he was unable to enlist several times. Why was that? Why was he unable to enlist? More about that in a second. Next slide, please. When the war broke out on August the 4th, 1914, there's about 2,000 Indian students in London. Most of them are at British universities, they're involved in law, or they're looking to join the Indian Civil Service. And many of them, as British subjects, rushed to join the war effort. But some of them were rejected as nationalist revolutionaries, and others were rejected for other reasons, and I'll come to that in a minute too. Hardit Singh went to the recruitment office to join Britain's armed forces 4 times, and each time he was refused. The best that he could be offered was to be an orderly at the Brighton Hospital caring for India Corps casualties coming back from the Western Front. But he wanted to join the war effort. We can talk about perhaps why that was a little bit later. He wanted to join the war effort. And his tutor at Oxford, a chap called Sligger Urquhart, enables Malik to join the French Red Cross, the Croix-Rouge Française. That's the best that he can be offered to join the war. And he is asked by the French Red Cross to drive that ambulance from England down to Cognac in the west of France. Wow. And while he's in Cognac, he is servicing the hospitals with that ambulance. Cognac has 4 specialist hospitals who are treating French casualties from the Battle of Verdun. Next slide, please. But why was it difficult for those Indian students to join Britain's armed forces in 1914 and 15, even at the rank of private? That's the front cover of the Manual of Military Law, published by the War Office in 1914. And it classes any person of colour as, quote unquote, either an alien or, quote unquote, native, who, quote, might be enlisted in special circumstances or limited numbers, but could not hold any rank in His Majesty's regular forces above non-commissioned officer. You can't be an officer. And particularly in 1918 and into 1919, Hardit Singh's Malik's case is used to challenge that principle, particularly by officials at the India Office and, for a time, the Air Ministry. Next slide, please. Who are these chaps? The chap on the left is Malik's tutor at Oxford, Sligger Urquhart. The chap in the middle is David Henderson, who's the head of the Royal Flying Corps. And the chap on the right is Austin Chamberlain, Secretary of State for India in the first half of the First World War. The reason that Malik is enabled to join up is that he has friends in high places through his Oxford University connections. Then, as now, that's a very useful way of networking. While he's in Cognac with the French Red Cross, servicing the hospitals, Hardit Singh Malik, for the first time in his life, becomes excited by the idea of flying. He's inspired by the great French airman, Georges Guynemer. And he's given a suggestion that he might join the French Flying Corps, the Militaire Aéronautique. And he writes back to Oxford and tells Sligger Urquhart, his tutor, that the French, but not the British, will enlist him into their air forces. And his tutor at Oxford was furious, and he wrote a letter to the head of the Royal Flying Corps, as was David Henderson. And as a result of that connection between 2 former Oxford men, Hardit Singh Malik is asked to go back from Cognac to London for an interview at the Air Ministry. Next slide, please. Oops. There we go. What he didn't know until a little bit later was that he was one of 5 airmen that were recruited into the Royal Flying Corps during a very small window of time between October 1916 and March of 1917. He wasn't on his own. There were 5 of them: Gigi Boy, Sen, Valinka, Roy, and Malik. Why was it that the 5 were recruited into the Royal Flying Corps and then the window closed? Because after March of 1917, there are no more Indian nationals recruited into the Royal Flying Corps. Why is that? During the Battle of the Somme, which is the summer of 1916, the head of the Royal Flying Corps, General Hugh Trenchard, can we go to the previous slide, please? That one, thank you. Trenchard, who's on the left here, bottom left here, is running short of men during the terrible Battle of the Somme. And we know this because he writes back to Lord Asquith, who is the British Prime Minister. He writes this on the 21st of September 16, quote, "It's not a question of difficulty of supplying pilots. It is a question as to whether it can be done or whether it can't be done. If we cannot do it, then we are beaten in this war." And as a result of those pilot shortages in the Royal Flying Corps, Indian nationals resident in Britain began to be recruited. And the chap on the right, bottom there, Sefton Branca, he's head of recruitment for the Royal Flying Corps. He says that those 5 Indian pilots, including Hardit Singh Malik, they are test cases to see how they get on with British personnel. They are test cases. Next slide, please. Some great pictures. This is Hardit Singh Malik during flight training. Lots to tell you about those. So how is it that he's accepted? Everyone who knew Hardit Singh Malik believed that he was officer material, all of his peers at Oxford. But, quote, "no native," unquote, could be an officer. So a loophole needs to be found in the Manual of Military Law. One official suggests he can be an honorary officer, After all, as one of the officials points out, the German Kaiser had until the end of 1915, well into the First World War, been an honorary admiral in the Royal Navy. It was pointed out that the bearer does not exercise any actual power, and in a single-seat plane, he wouldn't have to command anyone. And that was, of course, the issue, was an Indian national commanding British personnel. That was the sticking point. Nevertheless, the rules were bent, and the young Sikh was in the Royal Flying Corps. And in March of 1917, he joins up at South Farnborough with a temporary, during the First World War only, honorary commission. And he says, quote, "I was allowed to keep my turban, but I had to wear an outsized flying helmet. I had one made by a hatter at Piccadilly." Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. After training, Hardit Singh Malik is posted to 28 Squadron, and he will fly during the Third Battle of Ypres, which you may know as the Battle of Passchendaele. The weather was appalling during the Passchendaele battle, and Hardit Singh's squadron, 28 Squadron, was led by what we know in First World War terms as a thruster, somebody who wants to attack the Germans at every possible occasion. And his name is Captain William Barker. And Barker hears, on arriving on the Western Front, that the Red Baron, Baron von Richthofen, is across the way at Markebeke, not far from where 28 Squadron and Hardit Singh Malik are based. And Barker wants to have a pop at the Red Baron von Richthofen. And he calls for volunteers on the 26th of October, 1917. And 4 planes take off. And that sortie, that attack on Richthofen's flying circus will be a life-changing moment for Hardit Singh Malik. This is what he says about the operation. It was a foolhardy operation, and the commanding officer actually forbade it. But Barker got the okay from Wing HQ. The Germans were crazy too. We found 20 of Richthofen's squadron heading our way. There was a terrific fight, and 2 of the 4 of us were shot down. I shot down one of the Germans, and then Barker and I turned tail. There was a sharp smell of petrol and a pain in my leg. I crash-landed behind our own lines and fainted. When Hardit Singh's plane was recovered, it had got 450 German bullet holes in it. He went to hospital in London, and when recovered, was able to rejoin his squadron, which had then moved to Italy. And he flies in Italy for a short time and then is sent back to London, where he flies from Biggin Hill, famous fighter squadron base in England. And he's posted to 141 Squadron. Next slide, please. And there's a photograph of Hardit Singh very clearly at the back. He and the young men in that photograph have just stolen that advertising hoarding off a tea shop roof, and they're posing around it, as young men are prone to do. When Hardit Singh arrived at Biggin Hill, it was noted by many of the officers. And when I went to visit there a few years ago, I was delighted to read in the official history that Hardit Singh Malik's name featured in the history of Biggin Hill at the back. I'm going to read it to you because it's very noteworthy. This is the excerpt from Biggin Hill. A few days later, another pilot arrived, Lieutenant Hardit Singh Malik, a Sikh from Rawalpindi. He turned up late one night, long after the orderlies had gone off duty, and was given an empty room in the requisition cottage. In the morning, the other officers were woken by piercing yells and dashed out of their rooms to see what was happening. A batman, entering the new arrival's home with shaving water, had been startled out of his wits by the turbaned and black-bearded head on the pillow and fled before streams of Hindustani invective from the indignant Malik. A keen cricketer and golfer, Malik was one of the most popular officers at Biggin Hill. He staunchly refused to part with his turban and somehow managed to fit over it an outsized flying helmet, earning him the affectionate nickname of the Flying Hobgoblin from the ground crew. I was never sure that he would be happy with that nickname, but that was what they referred to him. Next slide, please. I'd just like to, if you just bear with me, I'd just like to share with you something that's really important about this story. And in particular, I'd like to remind us about what's happening in the wider war in March of 1918, because it has implications for Hardit Singh and brings him to the attention of those high-ranking officials in government. In March of 1918, the British Army is overstretched in France, and it comes close to defeat when the Germans mount a major offensive on the Western Front. The Imperial War Cabinet, led now by Lloyd George, are not only dealing with the immediate crisis, but they're also considering, from the perspective of 1918, that March, that the war looks as though it's going to go on into 1919, and there's even some planning for 1920 from the perspective of March of 1918. And their biggest headache, their biggest concern is that Britain, by the 1st of January 1919, is going to be very short of men, very short. The War Office estimate 250,000. Earl Haig, the head of the British Expeditionary Force, estimates 500,000. And in the War Cabinet discussions of the summer of 1918, there's only one source of extra recruitment that the War Cabinet, led by Lloyd George, can identify to solve the recruitment troubles that Britain's got. That is India. India is the only source of further recruitment in the empire. Forget about Australia and Canada, they're done. India has greater recruitment sources to tap into. But Lloyd George and the cabinet know that if moderate Indian politicians in Delhi are to be engaged with this recruitment process of further Indians, then concessions needed to be offered by London. And one of those concessions is that they need to offer King's Commission status, that's officer status, in Britain's armed forces to Indian nationals with the same status as British officers. And small schemes are put in place in the summer of 1918, both in the British Army and the Royal Flying Corps, what becomes the RAF. And I'm sure you know this, but it's worth underlining. In 1918, more sepoys are recruited into the Indian Army than the rest of the First World War put together and 1913. 1918 is the great recruitment drive of the First World War for India, supported by Gandhi, incidentally. Next slide, please. I've got my eye on the time, Sri. Is that okay? But I'd like to do some discussion with you. What's all of this got to do with Hardit Singh Malik? Indian commissions are now on the agenda, and his honorary commission is removed, and he becomes a full lieutenant in the RAF. The RFC has now become the RAF on the 1st of April 1918, awarded by the Air Ministry. He's become a lieutenant, a full lieutenant. And I'm leaving a gap now because I've been telling you about this terrible situation on the Western Front in March of 1918. And of course, during the summer and autumn of 1918, Germany's forces collapse for all sorts of reasons, too many to go into now. Germany's forces collapse. And Hardit Singh Malik has to decide what he's going to do. And he tells Sefton Branca, the head of recruitment for the RAF, that he wants to go back to Britain to tie up his affairs at Eastbourne, in Oxford, and in London. He wants to go home to Rawalpindi. He's not seen his parents for 10 years, since he was 14. He's now 24. And then he wants to join the RAF in India. The new squadrons, well, the squadrons which had formed before the First World War, just before the First World War, which fly on the northwest frontier. And I'm leaving another gap because the war ends on the 11th of November. There's a ceasefire. And those initiatives that I've told you about to offer Indian nationals commissions in Britain's armed forces with the same status as British officers are reneged upon because Indian soldiers are no longer needed. And that sop to moderate Indian politicians is removed. Next slide, please. Hardit Singh Malik returns to Britain. He returns to Punjab. And there is concern because Hardit Singh is going to join the RAF in India. But the problem is he's an officer, and the schemes to allow officers have just been removed by the Viceroy's government in Delhi, approved by the War Office. And telegrams go if you go into the archives of the British Library, telegrams are going between Delhi and London from Edwin Montagu to Lord Chelmsford, which name-check Hardit Singh. They are talking about Hardit Singh. What are we going to do with him? He's going to arrive in Punjab, but he can't be a flying officer. But he wants to join the RAF there. He wants to continue with the RAF there. And I'm paraphrasing now, but basically, some British officers, even though they know it's against the principles that have now been laid out by the British government, they keep writing to squadrons in India saying, Malik is on his way, he's a really good chap, let him fly. And there's an argument that goes on in the British government because Sefton Branca is a supporter of Hardit Singh Malik, and he's writing to the government of India saying, you must employ him. And the government of India is saying, no, that is not our policy. Next slide, please. This involves Jallianwala Bagh. Hardit Singh arrives home in February and March of 1919 to a Punjab where there is unrest. Why? Because, as you know, there's been coercive over-recruitment in Punjab because of that recruitment I've been telling you about. There's plague, there are food shortages, and many, many sepoys returning from the Middle East, from Europe, are returning back to Punjab to the regressive Rowlatt Acts and the limited Chelmsford-Montagu reforms. It's a long story, but on the 13th of April, 1919, although he's only been home a month, Hardit Singh Malik gets married. And you'll know that date because the 13th of April, 1919, is the day that 150 miles away, while Malik is getting married in Rawalpindi, in Amritsar, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre takes place. And what's often forgotten, though, is that the next day, the RAF bombed Punjabi villages at Dula and Bangwapura, killing another 12 people. And there's no way that the RAF in India are going to allow a Sikh to fly their aeroplanes, and Malik's own family and Hardit Singh did not want to fly either in those circumstances. And that's really the end of his RAF career. Next slide, please. Nearly done. He marries Prakash. They have 3 children. He returns to Britain, initially to join the RAF, but he joins the Indian Civil Service. You'll have to read the book to find out that. It's fascinating. Sorry, plugging again. He enjoys, as you know, a long distinguished career as a civil servant, most notably as the first Indian High Commissioner to Canada and the first Indian ambassador to France, appointed by Nehru. Next slide, please. He's awarded the OBE and the Légion d'honneur. That is his obituary when he died. That's the London Times. That's how Hardit Singh Malik was known in London. He was known by so many people. He retired in 1957. He moved to Delhi, where he died in 1985. He was interviewed, by the way, in Hindi, in English. You can see them online. He's playing golf into his late 70s, and his autobiography, A Little Work, A Little Play, is published posthumously in 2011. That issue of officer commissions never goes away. Indian politicians are furious that the two-tier system is still in operation. And in the mid-1920s, the Sandhurst Commission is established to select the first Indian officers for the proposed Indian Air Force. And Hardit Singh Malik was chosen as the only surviving Indian who'd seen combat with the RAF during the First World War to appear before the commission. And Hardit Singh played a significant part in the decision to send 6 officers for pilot training to RAF Cranwell in 1930 in England, including Subroto Mukherjee, the first Chief of Staff for the Indian Air Force. He was chosen by Malik, by Hardit Singh Malik. Last slide, please. And the last slide, next one, and that one. Yeah, let's go there. When he died in 1985, he had 2 bullets embedded in his leg from that dogfight over Passchendaele. The surgeon recommended leaving them in. He had them through his whole life. And he loved that. Connected him to his past. And he said it somehow seemed appropriate because that miraculous escape with 450 bullet holes going into his aeroplane had a profound effect on his life and convinced him that one dies only when one's time comes. A conviction which led to a kind of fearlessness which gave him strength throughout his life in facing the crises which lay ahead. But he believed that his time in the Royal Flying Corps and the RAF had been the making of him. It's a bit of a gallop through. Thank you very much for listening. I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. What a wonderful story against odds. And what a human being Hardit Singh Malik was. I mean, he is, in my mind, he's one of the closest things that we produced at that time to a citizen of the world. And he was welcomed. He had friends in Europe, in North America, and of course in India. And what an absolutely remarkable man. So I have a few questions, and I am under notice that we'll have to give up the stage at short notice because preparations have to be made for the CDS and the function that's the valedictory function that will be next. So if we stop abruptly, please forgive us. It's all in a good cause. But with that in mind, I think among the questions I'd like to ask you, Stephen, one is, you've woven together the story of, the sort of boy's adventure story of Malik becoming a First World War pilot flying camels. Stephen didn't mention it, but Hardit Singh flew Sopwith camels, which in some ways were the most prestigious fighter aircraft or scout aircraft, as they were known at that time. Camels were among the most prestigious scout aircraft that anyone could fly in that time. So there is, at one level, there's a schoolboy adventure story of an Indian getting to fly the hottest aircraft in the sky at that time. And at another level, there is the development of how there is a story of how Indians were being progressively accepted, or on a 2 steps forward, 1 step back basis into the British administrative infrastructure. So I think one of my big questions would be from the point of view of the schoolboy adventure story. I'm an aviation historian, so I make no apologies for that. Hardit Singh Malik was one of, as Stephen said, 5, maybe 7 Indians who went through some stage or other of learning to fly, including at least one person who I believe was a member of the Gwalior royal family's household, although he wasn't a prince himself. But among those others who were commissioned, all of whom got to fly a few months after Hardit Singh Malik did, among them was Indralal Roy. And Indralal Roy in some ways is more of an adventure story because he actually ended, he was shot down and killed himself before the end of World War II. But in his time as an active an RAF and RFC pilot, he actually shot down 9 or 10 German aircraft. So that actually makes him an ace, which by the standards of that time, and please note, ace is very much an unofficial term. By the standards of that time, Hardit Singh Malik was not an ace. I mean, he opened so many doors, so we're not minimizing what he did, but he wasn't an ace in the way Indra Lal Roy was. And I asked Stephen yesterday or the day before when we met, whether he would consider doing a similar book about Indra Lal Roy, because I think from an aviation schoolboy interest point of view, I think that's a great story. And Stephen had an interesting answer why. So, you want to tell us about why you couldn't write about Indra Lal Roy on the same scale?
Yeah, of course. Sri and I follow each other on Twitter, or what used to be known as Twitter, and Sri has mentioned Indra Lal a few times. So occasionally, when I was researching Hardit Singh Malik, it was obvious to me that some of the same files and some of the same areas of research in the archive at the British Library might contain material about Indra Lal Roy. But interestingly, there was nothing. There's nothing about that. And the reason is because I think he was killed in 1918, and the war then didn't come to an end. And the reason that Hardit Singh came to my attention was exactly for the reason that I mentioned, which is that he wanted to return to India to become an RAF pilot when it was politically no longer possible to be so. So I think solely on the back of that, Hardit Singh has a thick file, an inch thick, containing all of the written material that I was delighted to discover. But I also went to the National Archives in another part of London, at Kew, indeed. And at Kew, there's other areas where I knew Indra Lal Roy's squadron. So I started to look through the materials related to that squadron. And although I found some log references to some of the sorties that he went on to, there's no material that would give us a strong narrative. So I think some of the other sources, some of the familial sources would need to be tapped. If you and I were going to follow that up, we would need to track down family members. We would also need to do newspapers. We would also need to look in other areas of RAF, Royal Flying Corps, archives that exist in other places, for example, at some of the squadrons where he might have been trained. So we'd have to go those. But from my point of view, what's interesting is it's the political stuff that highlights Hardit Singh Malik's war service.
Thanks, Stephen. So that was my question on, on my schoolboy interest. A question on the larger political developments. I think, as you probably know, Indian participation in World War I, which was frankly less controversial than Indian participation in World War II. There was nothing like the Quit India movement in India at that time. But Indian participation in World War I was very much contingent on an assumption that India would be rewarded by dominion status after the war. And you've talked about how the opportunities for Indians to be commissioned officers were withdrawn at the end of the war, and dominion status, the prospect of dominion status also disappeared somehow after the end of World War I. So do you see connections, or do you see any way in which some doors that were opening for Indians during World War I were abruptly closed as soon as World War I was over?
Yeah, dominion status, just to set the context of this, dominion status was given to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, what one referred to as the White Dominions, by 1901. By 1901, that's pretty early. And Indian politicians constantly referred to that as an interim aspiration towards independence. But from the perspective, we always must read history forwards, from the perspective of 1919, in spite of any SOPs that had been offered by the British government, any suggestions or hints that there would be movements towards independence, what the First World War had shown is just how valuable India's contribution had been. Men, materiel, financial support, huge. Shashi Tharoor has written a good deal about that. And whatever else one may think about his book, it triggered great discussions about just what India's contribution may have been. But there's two other reasons why I think India did not make any moves, or the British government did not offer any movement towards independence. The legal framework in 1919 was in place to ensure that British power continued. The Defence of India Act had been passed in 1915 to make sure that any threats to their power would not take hold. And under the Act of 1919, and particularly the Rowlatt Acts, the Defence of India Act of 1915 was re-established. So there's a legal infrastructure which maintains control. The British, and thirdly, the British very clearly believe that they also have the military infrastructure to maintain control within India. One of the reasons that Australia was given Dominion status, there's hardly any British troops in Australia or Canada or New Zealand. There's a lot of British troops in India, a lot of them. And of course, one of the reasons that Jallianwala Bagh comes about is that Dyer believes that he has the force and the right and the legal right to force to enforce the Rowlatt Acts. And it's for those three reasons that the British believe that they do not need to give Dominion status, in spite of reneging shamelessly on what had been offered. From my point of view, shamelessly reneging. And Hardit Singh Malik's story about one concession that's offered and then reneged upon is a really good example of the personal connecting into the political.
Thank you, Stephen. I saw the lights flickering, and I think I saw Squadron Leader China up there at the corner entrance looking a little worried. So I'm not sure if we have a moment or two yet, but if we do, I'll just make the quick point, which is again irresistible to me as an aviation historian, that 28th Squadron, the squadron that Hardit Singh Malik went to war with, 28th Squadron of the Royal Air Force actually came to India in the period between the wars. And when the Indian Air Force's number 1 squadron was set up on the 1st of April 1933, they were actually flying alongside 28th Squadron. So I don't see any references in the contemporary documents of 28th Squadron and 1 Squadron, many of which have survived. I don't see any acknowledgement of the historical connection that 28th Squadron flying alongside number 1 Squadron Indian Air Force was actually where Hardit Singh, the squadron that an Indian first qualified to be a pilot with. But to me, it's a fascinating story. The two squadrons flew side by side. They competed with each other in many ways. They went to war in Burma together. 8 years after the Indian Air Force, after 1 squadron of the Indian Air Force had been formed. 8 years after 1 squadron had been formed, 1 squadron Indian Air Force and 28th Squadron of the Royal Air Force went to war together in Burma, carried out raids together, carried out joint raids, some of which were led by Jumbo Majumdar, who was an Indian officer. So an Indian officer led a combined RAF and Indian Air Force combined RAF and Indian Air Force raids on Japanese targets out of Burma in the year 1941, in the year 1942, actually, which is a nice little progression for everyone, including 28th Squadron. 28th Squadron's RAF still flies today. It's flying Chinook helicopters. It was flying Chinook helicopters in Afghanistan until a couple of years ago. I don't know where they are now, but just a little bit of trivia. So, is there anything else, Stephen, that you'd sort of want to bring out if we have a couple of minutes more?
Actually, I think we're okay, yeah. Just something about my personal trip in the last few days I'd love to share with you, actually. while writing the book or preparing the book, I was in touch with Hardit Singh Malik's granddaughter, Sanchia, who lives in Delhi. And like her grandfather, she is a fluent French speaker, and we have the joy of a little bit of French conversation, which is always enjoyable to be had. So that's lovely to meet her for the first time, and we shared some memories of her grandfather. So this is current heritage. She's very proud of that, as the whole family. The other thing that I've done in the last few days is I visited the Indian Air Force Museum at Palam. And I do encourage you to go there, because some of the stories that Sri has mentioned about Indra Lal Roy and some of the other 5 airmen who were enlisted in that narrow window at the start of the war, they have exhibits about the 5 of them. They are seen as the 5 first aviators of India, of various backgrounds. But I went purposely not to see that. I went to see the uniform of Hardit Singh Malik, the flying jacket, suit that he wore. It's actually called a Sidcut suit. And there it is in one of the cases, and I was enabled to open the case, take it out. Would you like to know what I did? It's a very personal thing as a history bod. It's a bit geeky. When they allowed me to take it out, I did wonder, if there's 2 bullet holes in it. Sadly not, sorry. I was slightly disappointed. These things don't normally happen, and it didn't on this occasion. I'm sure he had 3 or 4 Sidcot suits. But I would encourage you, if you want to see an outfit that's been worn over the Western Front or in Italy that relates to a heritage 100 plus years ago now, then the Indian Air Force Museum, you can see the Sidcut suit worn by Hardit Singh Malik, and that gave me such a joy, second only to meeting Sanchia Malik.
I'm going to add one more bit of trivia from my aviation geekery point of view. As Stephen says, the name used for those flying suits, for those sheepskin-lined flying suits during World War I was Sidcot. Sidcot was short for Sidney Cotton, who was the inventor of those flying suits. Sidney Cotton was an Australian who served for many years in the Royal Air Force, then left the Royal Air Force, and by the time of India's independence, he was an independent aviator and arms dealer. And he procured 2 former RAF Lancaster bombers at throwaway prices, I'm sure, and he used them for gun running, including some guns into Hyderabad during the then Hyderabad state's attempt to resist accession to India in 1947. So the inventor of the Sidcot suit has a certain historical connection to Indian history. And so I am seeing movement in the in the doors. So I will actually. I think we're at a logical point. There's much more I could ask you, Stephen, but I think we're at a logical point to leave the stage to the Air Force Band and the Chief of Defense Staff, General Chauhan. So with great thanks to you, Stephen, and thanks, of course, to USI, the Manekshaw Centre, and my personal thanks always to Squad Leader Rana China and General Sharma. So,
thank you, Sri. Pleasure.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
It's been great fun for us. I hope you've enjoyed it.